Now, along to what I have said in the very beginning, that European Heritage Label meant to complement other lists, not to compete with them, and to show, to prove that the memory is really a crucial element of heritage nowadays. I would like to ask to take the floor Professor Jean-Louis Luxen, the former President of the Cultural Heritage Committee of the Council of Europe and also former Secretary General of ICOMOS for many years. Professor Luxen serves at the moment as a Professor Emeritus at the Catholic University of Leuven, and I hope as I know, he will speak about the sites of memory on the World Heritage List, as it was the main of his research recently. Professor Luxen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. Thank you for inviting me here, and thank you for your hospitality. I'm in a beautiful hotel, which is a heritage hotel. Thank you. I am happy that we have an opportunity to make some comparisons between the scheme of European Heritage Label and the process of the World Heritage List, which is the 1972 Convention of UNESCO. Does it work? Closer, okay. Is it better? I think in many respects they are complementary. I just would like to tell the President that the first time I came to Krakow in 1976, which was earlier, and you know, Krakow doesn't need a European program to be recognized as one of the European cultural capitals, like Dresden, Florence, Oxford, Heidelberg, and so many. So I had the privilege to come very often here, including last year for the World Heritage Committee when Professor Puschla was the chair. Thank you. So I could have put under the title of Sites of Memory of the World Heritage List the same subtitle as Changes, Challenges and Perspectives, because the World Heritage Convention is also under threat. I will just focus on one of the aspects of those threats, which is the sites of memory. How is it? Okay. So this is my contents. I have 4 parts. I think I need to introduce in a few words the World Heritage Convention, because some of you are familiar with it, but I am afraid this is not the case for all the participants in this meeting. And then I will stress just 3 of them, among many others, current issues, current challenges that the World Heritage Committee is facing. I will propose some tentative responses to those challenges. And finally, I will just give you the final decision that was taken by the World Heritage Committee in Manama in last July. So, quickly, to give a background, the World Heritage Committee, the World Heritage Convention has 193 state parties, which is one of the largest international conventions being adopted by so many countries. There is a General Assembly meeting every 2 years. Out of it comes a World Heritage Committee, which has the decision power, with 21 countries meeting each year. Last year in Krakow, this year in Manama in Bahrain. The Secretariat is the mission of the World Heritage Center, located at UNESCO. But the decisions are taken by the committee and not by UNESCO, even if sometimes in the public opinion you have a confusion of responsibility. There are 3 advisory bodies: ICOMOS for the cultural heritage, IUCN for the natural heritage, and ICROM, especially in the field of capacity building. And then there is a World Heritage Fund. Unfortunately, you know that UNESCO doesn't have much funds, yet you have a World Heritage Fund that can make some cooperation process. Second point, the convention is a comprehensive protection scheme. I stress the word protection because very often people just have in mind that the World Heritage Convention is about listing like the marvels of the world. But the theme of the convention is protection. And there are different levels of activity, of actions. First of all, each country has to propose a tentative list. That means a preliminary selection of sites. And then you have the inscription on the World Heritage List, which is a long process that takes at least 2 years to be prepared, the decision being taken by the committee, as I told you. And later on, which is important, there is a periodic reporting. Every 6 years, each country has to report on the state of conservation of the site. And when there are some specific danger on the site, you could have a reactive monitoring. the committee could send some experts to visit the site. I think it's important also for the label that to be sure that the conditions that were to be met at the time of the inscription are still maintained in the long term. Otherwise, you lose the credibility of the whole process. You also have a list of heritage in danger. There is a program of international assistance, and there is a stress point on educational programs. So it's a comprehensive protection system. They are based on two kinds of norms, the convention itself, and then what they call the operational guidelines that have been established by the committee itself. The whole process becomes a quite sophisticated system, and it's not so easy for a new state party becoming member of the committee to be aware of the history of the convention. This is one of the challenges that they are to be faced. Now, what are the requirements for the inscription? The property must have an outstanding universal value from the point of view of history, art, or science. This is from the convention. But you also have to meet the test of authenticity or integrity. The site must have the highest level of legal protection at the national level, and there is a requirement of a management plan. Those are the four main requirements. Now, the one that is the most difficult to comprehend is the first one about outstanding universal value. I give you the definition given by the operational guidelines. We call it OUV. That means that the cultural and or the natural significance must be so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. This is a very demanding definition. Now, how do we recognize the outstanding universal value? There is a set of 10 criteria. I will not go through all of them. I just would like to develop the criterion 6, which is the one related to sites of memory, which says that criterion 6 asks the property to be directly and tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas or beliefs, with artistic and literary works of outstanding universal significance. And then the committee considers that this criterion should preferably be used in conjunction with other criteria. This is the present situation. This is the statistic as we have now, the figures of 2018 after the Manama Conference. 1,092 sites have been inscribed, 844 for culture, 210 for nature, and 38 for mixed site. I just put in black the figures of Europe and North America, because Europe and North America have half of the total of nominations and more than half the cultural nominations, sites, which is provoking some imbalance in the list and some resentment from other regions of the world who have the feeling that the definition of the heritage is very much Eurocentric, and sometimes they don't feel very comfortable with the concept itself. It is also the case that the European countries have more human and financial resource just to prepare a dossier. But we have to take that into account because I believe Europe has to take care of her own cultural cooperation, but I believe we have a responsibility for the other regions of the world. Professor Konkolewski did mention the colonialism that many European countries were taking part of, and in that respect, I believe there is some responsibility from Europe towards other parts of the world. We will come back to the point later. Now, my point two in the World Heritage Convention, just those who take the picture, I just told that you could just ask a copy of my presentation. There is no worry about that. The point is that the Criterion 6 have been much discussed in the World Heritage Committee because it's very difficult sometimes to define the outstanding universal significance and the link with the site. So there was a working group led by Professor Christina Cameron that prepared a report by a young PhD assistant, Judith Herman, a very important one that is posted on the World Heritage Center website. I give the figures of 2017, explaining that out of a total of 1,073 figures of last year, we have Criterion 6 applied for 240 of them, a majority being on the cultural properties. Only 10 or 11 for the natural properties. So there is a limited number of sites that have the Criterion 6. That was a meeting that took place in Warsaw. I think, Professor Woschler, you were attending it? And then, this is a long story, because in 1979, on the occasion of the inscription of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp on the list, there was a famous report by Professor Parent, who used to be president of ICOMOS, about the positive and negative associated values. And he was recommending a cautious approach in applying Criterion 6, already in 1979. And there is an important statement of the World Heritage Committee saying that particular attention should be given to cases which fall under Criterion 6, so that the net result would not be a reduction in the value of the list due to the large potential number of nominations as well as to political difficulties. Nominations concerning, in particular, historical events or famous people could be strongly influenced by nationalism or other particularism, in contradiction with the objectives of the World Heritage Convention. This is a text from 1979. And at that time, the inscription of Auschwitz took place with that sentence: the committee decides to enter Auschwitz concentration camp on the list as a unique site and to restrict the inscription of other sites of a similar nature. Should not be a precedent for a whole series of similar sites. So there was already a warning in 1979. I just would like now to present some examples of sites of memory. We just have to take into consideration that the World Heritage Convention asked for a cultural property to be place-based. You need a territory, you have a perimeter and a buffer zone. So it is a tangible and physical property that is being inscribed, a specific location or landscape. But it could be considered as a multi-community heritage with the potential of multiple interpretations. We know that from the beginning. A majority of the sites could be considered as positive sites, positive using the vocabulary of the committee. They are tombs or homes of illustrious personalities, places associated with famous artists, Salzburg is connected to Mozart. Human rights affirmation, the first landing of New Zealand. The Peace Palace of The Hague could be considered as one of those positive. I have some illustration of them. This is the Confucius tomb in China, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Abu Simbel and Philae temples in Egypt, Borobudur in Indonesia, Kandy sacred site with the relic of the tooth of the Buddha, and then the unique natural site being inscribed under Criterion 6 alone is the Tongariro National Park, which is the Maori landing place in New Zealand. Old Nara historic monuments in Japan, and also the citadel of Sans Souci in Haiti, which was the place for the first republic after liberation of Haiti from colonial period. Those could be considered as positive, but also have negative sides, once again using the terminology of the committee. Those are mainly war sites, places of human rights abuse, crime against humanity, crimes of dictatorship, torture, slavery, discrimination, ethnic cleansing, forced labor, colonial repressions. It could be also places that record the deliberate destruction of heritage, like Bamiyan, and so on. I give you some example of them. One nomination that was examined in Manama are the cemeteries of the First World War in Belgium and France for the Flanders Field. They have also the Rwanda genocide for memorial sites, which are on the tentative list at this stage. You have in Buenos Aires the School of Mechanics of the Marine Argentina, where they had torture during the dictatorship. And you have another kind of negative, this Port Arthur convict site in Australia, where the first convicts were brought from the UK. We also have the possibility to move from a negative to a positive definition, which is the case of Mostar. And in the nomination of Mostar in 2004, it says, with the renaissance of the old bridge and its surroundings, the symbolic power and meaning of the city of Mostar as an exceptional and universal symbol of coexistence of communities has been reinforced and strengthened, underlining the unlimited efforts of human solidarity for peace and powerful cooperation in the face of overwhelming catastrophes. So, it will never be the case for Bamiyan, but for Mostar, they could have a reconstruction and as a kind of symbolic rehabilitation of the way of communities living together, the inscription of the World Heritage List. In Poland, we have to mention Warsaw, that was completely destroyed. And despite the fact that it was not really meeting the test of authenticity, it was inscribed in 1980 just for the symbolic strength of the reconstruction. You have Jerusalem, which is the most sensitive site. During the last committee, you have 3 pages of examination of the problems raised in the management of Jerusalem and more globally in the occupied territories. Then I move to my second consideration, which are the current issues. One first current issue is the inconsistency in criteria reference. You know, the committee, the members are changing, and sometimes they no longer apply the same criteria. So this is a difficulty when you have to read it afterwards and try to understand the logic of the whole system. We have, for instance, sites that have been inscribed under Criterion 6 alone, which is the Maison des Esclaves in Gorée Island, which is Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, also the Rila Monastery of Bulgaria. So there is a different kind of sites clearly on Criterion 6 alone. But then you have sites that could be considered as memory sites, where they do mention the memorial aspect. For instance, the Zanzibar stone town of Zanzibar is inscribed, and in the statement of significance, there is a reference to the slavery on the eastern coast of Africa. The same way for Cartagena in Colombia, where there was a market for slaves for a long time. It is recognized in the statement of significance. Now we have other sites where that aspect has not been taken into consideration in the statement of significance. Jeddah, for instance, that has been for over centuries a place for entry of slaves for the Arabic Peninsula. You also have in Germany 2 or 3 sites. There is another one in Essen, where you had forced labor during the war. And that was not mentioned in the statement of significance. The point is that afterwards, the Germans made the move to add in the management system information of the public, making reference to the fact that there had been forced labor in those sites. They did it afterwards, but it was not mentioned in the statement of significance. That is the first change that we are observing. There is another issue, which is a change in interpretation over time. Globally, you have a growing importance of the intangible dimension of heritage. Even if it is listed as a cultural property, physical one, there is a tendency to highlight the intangible dimension of it. And then that comes to sometimes a retroactive statement of significance. I have a good example here. It's the Ayers Rock, and that is becoming Uluru-Kata Chuta. It was inscribed in 1987 as a natural site, but then the Aboriginal people came explaining that there were some very important intangible dimension in the site, and there was a new move in 1994 to list it also under criterion culture and criterion 6. This is an example of moving. Coming back to other points, we also observe that with the passage of time, some memorials of past events can become divisive. We have the examples of the controversy over the Confederation Monument in the US that took place last year. They wanted to remove some of the statues. And we recently have the example of, in Spain, I believe the parliament has decided to remove the tomb of Franco from the site of La Valle de los Caídos, where it is until now. So that means that after several years, you could revisit the interpretation of the site. So how can we take that into consideration when we decide the outstanding universal value at the beginning? There is a lack of flexibility to take into account that change. We also see that many states had a colonial domination consider memorials of past repression or humiliation as part of their cultural heritage. As an artistic or historic monuments, it would not meet the criterion of the World Heritage List. But it is so important for them that they try to put the criterion 6 value in order to have it recognized. And then globally we observe in Europe and elsewhere that there is a tendency for nationalistic approach, especially when the process of recognition is being driven by governments or government agency, which sometimes have a political agenda. That was one of the points of the presentation of Professor Konkolewski. Third current issue is that the committee is expecting some sensitive nominations to come. There is one that has already been presented, is by Belgium and France, that is called the Funerary and Memorial Sites of the First World War. I will explain you what has been the decision of the committee. Then you have in India, the Andaman Island, that was a kind of gulag at the time of the Indian Empire. In France, they would like to list the landing beaches of the D-Day in Normandy. If they do so, Turkey will come with the Gallipoli battle zones of the First World War. We know that Rwanda has on the tentative list 4 memorial sites of the Tutsi genocide. We know that Cabo Verde also want to present a concentration camp dating back from the Portuguese colonial period. And in Russia, you have a project for the heroes of the Battle of Stalingrad. These are also a few examples to show that they are giving ideas to many other sites of that kind to come in the list. So, I have been developing point A and point B. Now I think it's important to examine the tentative responses to those challenges. First of all, we have the UNESCO programs. They have other programs. For instance, a very important one is the Slaves Route program that has been developed. Many sites connected to slavery take part in that program, and many others could just join it. This is one way to establish a kind of international cooperation in that specific field. And the idea would be also to involve some European sites like Liverpool, Nantes, or Lisbon, that were port of entry or that has a responsibility in the slave traffic over the year on the Atlantic. At the present time, you have 16 sites being member of that program, but they is under development. Another UNESCO program is the 2003 Convention on the Intangible Dimension. However, the requirement is that it should be a living heritage, which is not always easy to meet when we speak about sites of memory, especially when they have a physical position. I just give 3 examples that show that there is an open possibility there. In Guadeloupe, there is a site that has been recognized, not for the site, but because of the cultural practice that is taking place there. The same thing everybody knows in Morocco, the square of Jamal El Fna, which is a square, which is a physical entity, but the value comes from the activity, the intangible dimension that is taking place in the place. And then recently, 2 years ago, on the 2003 convention, this district of Sanya in Peru has been inscribed, which is a site of memory of slavery and African cultural legacy. This is intangible, a living heritage, but connected to a site. That means that each time when we manage to have a connection between a living tradition and a site, the 2003 convention gives a possibility. Then you have the Memory of the World program, also a program of UNESCO. The objective is to identify documentary heritage and to make possible wide access and to address the issue of preservation of those archives. I give some examples that are very much connected to sites. For instance, in Perth and in Hobart, in 2 places. In Australia, they are recognized because they have the records of the convicts who came at the beginning. You have in Buenos Aires in Argentina, the Archivo de la Memoria. Those are the archives of the time of the dictatorship. In Barbados, you have the Memorial Library, where there is a list of the heritage of enslaved people of the Caribbean. In Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, you have the archives of the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum. And in Amman, Jordan, you have the film archives of Jordan. You have the archives of Palestinian refugees. That means also that when you can connect memory of the world with the site, once again there is a possibility for an inscription of site of memory on that specific program. And then we have regional program. I will not present your program. I just believe that it is very complementary, that it is very important that European sites do consider taking part of the program, and not only to the World Heritage, where there are already too many European sites being inscribed. So, unfortunately, outside Europe, it's very difficult to develop such a program. If you want to do that in Far East, and to bring together Japan, Korea, and China, and Indonesia, forget it. It's completely impossible. Even in Africa, even among Arab states, the only place where there would be a possibility is in Mercosur, in South America. But even so, unfortunately, there is no other regional program. But I am happy when I make a presentation in one of those countries to make reference to your example, because I believe it is interesting to propose that kind of scheme also for them. Then, to illustrate the fact that many people and many instances are working on the same theme of sites of memory, you have three important documents, among many others, at least three of them, of the United States. The first one dates back to 2007, is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. This is very important in global terms, could be in Europe also, when we speak about the Roms and so other categories, but it is especially important in other parts of the world, in China, in many countries, where it is difficult to obtain that there is the right to maintain and to protect and develop the cultural heritage of the minorities. This is one point. Then there is a report of the Human Rights Committee to the General Assembly, recent 2013, they are available on the website, a set of recommendations to ensure a multi-perspective approach in historical narratives and in history teaching, very much in the line of the textbook that is being developed between Poland and Germany. And they also insist that past events should be studied by historians. It is mainly historians who should write history, and not especially by political bodies. And then there is another report, 2014, on the memorialization process. Very interesting one. There are 10 pages. I just mentioned 2 or 3 ideas here. They insist that memorialization should be a process to mediate heritage disputes, requiring that communities in conflict agree at least to participate in the conservation of the heritage, even without a shared understanding of its significance. They also explain the importance of memorial policies for ensuring recognition of the victims and reparation of violations of human rights, as a goal of transitional justice, the idea of evolving process, and then recommendations to stimulate civic engagement and critical thinking. I think for the EHL program, it would be interesting for you to make reference to that study. Another tentative response is a thematic study on interpretation that was commissioned by UNESCO after 2 previous meetings. The first one took place in Seoul in November 2016, because there was a major industrial heritage site that has been inscribed on the list in Japan, where they had to forced labor during the Second World War. And the Korean wanted to have it recognized in the statement of significance. So there was a dispute between the 2 countries, and finally I believe they will come to the same solution that the Germans made in Zolverijn, is that in the management plan and in the presentation of the sites, there will be a mention of the fact that there has been forced labor there. And then there was another expert meeting that took place in Kigali, where the Rwanda representatives were explaining what they were preparing as a nomination site for the genocide. On the basis of those previous meetings, I was asked by the World Heritage Committee to be the chair of a small team to prepare a report on the interpretation of sites of memory. Once again, the report is available on the website. What were the terms of reference? We were asked to review theories, models, and techniques of interpretation to clarify the extent in which the World Heritage inscription may affect interpretation of heritage sites. That means that when a site is being listed, that means that the committee recognized the interpretation given by the state party presenting it. To explore the challenges and opportunities in the interpretation of sensitive heritage sites related to memory, including possible conflicting views of the values of a site, and to propose some best practice. The report was presented at the end of January. That was a working group, people from Barbados, Cambodia, Guatemala, Poland, Senegal, Tunisia, Australia. For the coalition USA, the rapporteur from the UK, and I was the chair. We made recommendations. There is a report and 17 recommendations. I cannot go through all of them. Most of them are general recommendations for any memory, for any site of memory, which means essentially to have inclusive interpretation, allowing for the multiple narratives to be presented. Even if they are contradictory, new techniques allow them to be presented at the same time, and insisting on the reference to the historical context, not to judge the past according to the opinion of today, just to take into consideration the context, and also to leave the priority to the historians to write history. And then we have 4 recommendations in particular for World Heritage Sites of Memory. One is to explain that even if if it is not explicitly sites of memory, it could be a memorial aspect in the site which requires interpretation. Then I will read them. Aspects which may hurt some communities, whether at national or at international level, the dimension should be particularly taken into account when developing the interpretation. So especially at the international level, you are supposed to have respect and understanding and look for dialogue. Point 16, in order to allow the development of inclusive interpretative frameworks, some World Heritage nomination of a property with potential divisive memories within some lapse of time, we suggest to wait 2 generations of 50 years before inscribing a site so that people have time to cool down their patience. And the last one is in developing interpretive frameworks for properties or nominated properties to take into account an international independent academic review of interpretation proposals, not to have it based only on the national analysis. 5th type of responses is the work of ICOM. I like to mention it because the museums are very important. Very often you have a site museum. And even if it is not a site museum, in many cases museums are presenting history or presenting objects, and they realize that there is a role in that respect. So much so that the Museum Day of 2017 was on saying the unspeakable in museums. That was the very theme that we are talking about. How to interpret and present a collective sensitive past. They are talking about the challenges of the making of memory about recent conflicts, They have also the challenge of objects taken away from their environment and from social spiritual significance, especially from other continents. The issue of repatriation of sacred ethnological artifacts. There is a strong demand from some country, and we see that even the President Macron in France has accepted to have a committee with Africa to examine to which extent some pieces of African art could be brought back in their country. And then there is a need in many museums to revisit the presentation of the colonial period. The last point, also very touchy one, is the conservation and exhibition of human remains, very often again, human remains coming from former colonies. So ICOMOS has been addressing those issues, and I think it's important to listen to their lessons. Then you have the ICOMOS discussion paper that has been presented at Manama, which is a very important document with a comprehensive analysis of the challenges of nomination of sites associated with memories of recent conflicts. They say that there has never been any clear answer from the World Heritage Committee to the question raised already in 1979, at the time of the inscription of Auschwitz, I did mention it, and against 1996 at the time of Hiroshima, because at that time again the question was raised of the suitability of war sites to be inscribed on the World Heritage List. What is the outstanding universal value of such a site? The question is still there. And ICOMOS explained what are the difficulties in comparative analysis of that kind of site. They also believe that listing would mean recognition of the interpretation given by the state party. Since the nominations are coming from a state party, you are to some extent linked to that interpretation. And to a large extent, memorialization should be considered, as the UN report says, as part of a dynamic process of post-conflict reconciliation process. But when you decide what is the outstanding universal value, there is a danger to freeze it and not to allow that evolving process. There were recommendations from ICOMOS, a need for a fundamental reflection, a need for guidance on the suitability of listing war sites and the related practical difficulties in the evaluation, and a need for a moratorium. Let's wait a little while before facing those type of nominations. I would like to mention also an important meeting that took place in Potsdam at the 1C Conference Center, where two main issues were raised in relation with the German Nazi camps. The first question was, would it be appropriate to inscribe other similar concentration camps? That was also a question coming from Germany, because they have no other such sites on their tentative list, but they wanted to be open to the analysis. There was a meeting mainly with many representatives of the Jewish community, and the answer is no. Due to its exceptional significance, Auschwitz-Birkenau encompasses all other former extermination camps and centers from the Second World War established by the Third Reich. So they make reference to the restriction of the inscription in 1979. So only Auschwitz-Birkenau for the Shoah. And that at the same meeting, they made recommendations to improve the standards of management of such sites. The emulation of good practice, education based on international dialogue and cooperation, conservation of objects that belong to the victims and of archives, archaeological research based on international cooperation, research on the victims as well as on perpetrators, and clear information regarding the citizenship and the nationality of the victims. There is a 3-page report that is also available if you want to read it. And if you allow me, since I am active in the Coalition of Sites of Conscience, I will explain what we are trying to do. The Coalition is a non-governmental agency. And the sites of conscience are defined as places of memory, could be historic site, museums, memorials, with 3 objectives. Confront historical dramas and their present legacies, engage the public in positive action on the issues raised at the site, and promote justice and a culture of human rights. This is to a large extent a reference of the message of Mandela, truth and reconciliation. Consider it as a dynamic process. Very often, one methodology is just to invite contemporary artists to express their feeling about what had happened and make the connection between past and present. So it is based, there is no conditions. Any site could apply on the conditions that the condition is that they accept the methodology of exchange of ideas and practice. I give you some examples. Among the 230 members in 55 countries, there is I did already mention it, La Escuela de Mecánica from Argentina, the Museum of Cambodia, which is on the memory of the world, La Maison des Esclaves World Heritage Site, Gulag, the Gulag site Perm 36 in Russia, Kigali Memorial is on the tentative list, and then, which is a very sensitive issue also about prisons, with the example of the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. So some examples. I give you some examples of sites that are part of the Sites of Conscience Coalition, some of them being also World Heritage Site, like Robben Island, the issue of civil rights and incarceration in the US. We have the delicate issue of comfort women in Korea that is not being accepted on the history of the world record, but that could be part of the coalition. And then we have in Cambodia the site participating in the activities. There is a site in Guernica. In the US, there are also the Japanese internment camp of the First World War. The coalition is mainly working at the regional level. US, North America, South America, Europe, MENA, Africa, Asia. And then I show 2 examples in Europe. Museo del Mar in Genova, the Red Star Line Museum in Antwerp, and Bois du Casier in Belgium, in connection with Ellis Island in New York, which is on the tentative list, on the issue of migration. They are developing a program remembering that tens of millions of Europeans were migrants to America, North America and South America, many, many more than the ones that are arriving in Europe today. So this is an interesting program being developed. I like to show the picture of Bois du Casier because Bois du Casier, and we have Christelle Detti, who is in the management team who is there, is both World Heritage, Site of Conscience, and European Heritage List. That means you can have the 3 labels because there are 3 complementary approaches to the issue of addressing sites of memory. So my last point is just the last slide. What was the decision of the World Heritage Committee in Manama last July? I speak under the control of Professor Vichy and Jacek. That was the decision. Recalling the reservation it has expressed concerning the inscription of sites related to negative memories. Recognize that the evaluation undertaken by ICOMOS may be considered effective until 2021. Decides to adjourn consideration of the nomination of the funerary and memorial sites of the First World War until a comprehensive reflection has taken place, and the committee in 2020 has discussed and decided whether and how sites associated with recent conflicts and other negative and divisive memories might relate to the purpose and scope of the World Heritage Convention and its operational guidelines. Encourages states parties to provide support to the undertaking of that comprehensive reflection, including through contributions and hosting of expert meetings, and notes that this nomination could only be considered upon review by the advisory bodies in light of the committee decision referred to above. That means that the committee did accept the proposal of ICOMOS to have a moratorium and to spend 1 full year, one year and a half until the meeting of July 2020, just to decide whether or not the inscription of that type of sites is in the objective, in the aim of the convention, and if it is the case, on which conditions. That will be the next step. Well, I'm coming to the end of my presentation. I hope we will find some connection with the theme that you have been raising, but I just would like to stress the importance of having contacts between the European Commission and UNESCO. I am not a go-between. I just believe that you should have direct contact because you are very complementary, and it is useful for UNESCO to have the European label and useful for you also to be connected to the World Heritage system. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And now I would like to ask our third keynote speaker, Ms. Bénédicte Selflat, chairperson of the European Heritage Label Panel. Ms. Bénédicte is the president of ICOMOS Belgium. She's an architect, and she was for many years also a member of the World Heritage Committee representing Belgian delegation. And she was one of the authors, which is very important, I think, in our discussion, one of the authors of the Council of Europe Convention on the Value of Culture Heritage for Society, which means FARO Convention. And as I said, during last year, she's also the president of ICOMOS Belgium. Bénédicte, I would like to ask you to start your presentation.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to first thank the ICC here for the nice invitation and for putting the European Heritage label firmly on the agenda of 2018, the European Year of Cultural Heritage. I would also like to stress that the European Heritage label is an effort, a joint effort by the sites, the national coordinators, the Commission, thank you Commission, and the European panel. I would like to thank Mr. Magnier for his courage to announce changes and for already proposing some ideas. I'm extremely pleased, I told him, because he showed that the reports of the panel have been read, and that's always very nice. But also, he came up with the 4 Cs. And as the inventor of the 4 Cs for the World Heritage Committee, I'm very pleased that the Commission is now taking up the same idea of 4 Cs for the European Heritage label. I can add immediately that, Mr. Magnier, that ultimately World Heritage added a 5th C, so I can only encourage you to look for a 5th C, but it's very successful to work with the Cs. We have already been seen that the 3 initiatives are very complementary. We have spoken about World Heritage. The 3 sites that you see are World Heritage. One of them is also a cultural route of the Council of Europe. And the little island you see is Skellig Michael. And I'm very happy to draw your attention to this monastery and hermitage, because actually it is nowadays a World Heritage Site. But it was also a pilot project for the architectural heritage of the European communities at the time. And at the time we had a wonderful celebration ceremony for the projects that were selected, which made me think, Schneska, when we were in Berlin, of your wonderful ceremony. Well, we had something very similar at the time at the top floor of the Berlaymont, the floor of the commissioners, and we came even at the 8 o'clock evening news. Now, does heritage come on the 8 o'clock evening news nowadays? And do we have the attention of the Commission, the European Commission? I don't know. Maybe we should think about. So I would like to, I was asked to talk about listing European heritage sites, which is a good title. I will provide a little bit more context because we received already a lot of questions about that. I will recall what the label is, raise a number of frequently asked questions. I will talk about its challenges, some of which have already been named, about lessons learned, and I will give you a look behind the scenes as far as I can and come with some concluding remarks. Let me say first that it's so popular to have lists. And Jean-Louis Luxen just mentioned the European Heritage List, but actually it's the European Heritage labels and sites of the list. So there is not really a European list. However, there has never been an intention to create such a European heritage list, but I can tell you there were many, many attempts. That idea has been floating around since the 80s. And there was even a resolution by the European Parliament based on intense discussions with the staff of the World Heritage Center at the time. And their hope was simply to reduce the number of European nominations on the World Heritage List. It did not succeed. The idea popped up once again when, during the drafting process of the Faro Convention, which was just named, and ultimately it was not integrated in the Faro Convention. But in the end, the Ministers of Culture decided to launch an intergovernmental initiative. Frédéric Mitterrand, that's, you see the logo of the intergovernmental initiative. You see a Martin Luther, because there were sites related to that in Germany, which have not been renominated under the current European Heritage label. You see a Swiss site, and you see a site, a Belgian site, the Cordon-Berg Palace, which had reapplied for the label, for the European Heritage label. Now, at the time, Frédéric Mitterrand, the French Minister of Culture and Communication, presented objectives as the European heritage, I quote, in all its remarkable diversity, is a tremendous asset for Europe. It transcends cultural, national, regional, or local distinctions and helps to develop the feeling among European citizens that they have a shared history while nurturing European ideas and values. End of quote. So the scheme was launched, the idea was launched in Granada, in Spain, and I welcome the person here who was very intensely connected to that scheme. But it was also proposed quite soon to transform the intergovernmental label into an EU initiative. Now, why? After several rounds of very thorough discussions, the European Heritage Label was formally adopted on 16 November of 2011. And the discussions were really, really thorough and done by people who knew the World Heritage Convention extremely well and also wanted something different. Now, why did our countries want the European Heritage Label to move from an intergovernmental initiative to an EU initiative? It's because they wanted to take a qualitative step forward. And they wanted it would allow to define clear criteria and bring added value. And the member states also wanted the label to reach its full potential. Anything familiar, Mr. Magny? The aims of the new heritage label have not really changed, but the decision makes a clear reference that a better understanding and appreciation, especially among young people, of their shared and yet diverse heritage would help to strengthen a sense of belonging to the Union and reinforce intercultural dialogue. End of quote. So this dual citizenship, the national and the EU citizenship, should bring some, let's say, some additional benefits for the people, in addition to the peace project for which the EU received the Nobel Prize. Maybe there is more. So I just explained the objectives. The picture about the iceberg is that there are very few EU programs that have a cultural objective. But we should never forget that many, many European policies, regulations and programs have a direct impact on our cultural heritage and our daily life environment. What sites can apply for the European Heritage Label? I have shown here 3 out of the 4 Polish sites, but don't worry, the 4th one will come later up. Actually, all types of heritage, from monuments and landscapes to books and archives, objects and intangible heritage linked to a place are eligible, provided that they meet the 3 selection criteria. And this is already one difference with the World Heritage Convention, which is a place or a based convention with roots in territory. Here we also have documents or intangible heritage. Let me quickly mention also that there is a scope for transnational sites or national thematic sites. So what we see with the label is that we have a truly global approach of cultural heritage. At least that's the potential. Let me go back to the 3 selection criteria because it's quite important. And it is one of the elements that makes the European Heritage Label stand out. First, the first criterion is about the European significance. And actually there are 2 strands. There is the history and culture or the building of the EU. But when the panel assesses this criterion, the panel looks also whether this European significance is fully understood, whether it's well articulated and convincingly conveyed by the sites. And this is a real challenge for most sites, because most of the sites also as individuals, we are used to a national narrative, and the sites themselves are mainly used to presenting their site to a national audience. And in contrast with the European Heritage Label, we ask to contextualize and to interpret the European significance in a European geographical and historical context so beyond our national borders and audiences. And it's very, very challenging also to do that in clear terms and to take all aspects into account. The second criterion is the project, because it's not enough to have, for a candidate site, to have a strong European dimension. They need a project to present this dimension to a European audience. And in fact, the projects are as diverse as are the sites. What the panel also looks at is the progress that the sites intend to make, and how the sites build upon their own characteristics to develop this project and bring their European dimension to a European audience. The third criterion is to have the operational capacity to carry out the project. And we have very, very small sites, which this morning we heard about, but we also have bigger sites, like the Imperial Palace in Vienna, and above it, it's a small Frenia partisan hospital. You can't imagine two sites that are more different, yet both received the European Heritage Label, and the panel was of the opinion that they both had the operational capacity to conduct the project. So, in addition to be well conserved and well managed, we ask, and in addition to have a European dimension, we ask this European project. The European dimension without a project and a management is not enough, and a strong project and a good management without a European dimension is not enough either. What the panel also does is to assess each site in a proportionate manner, and we have also provided a lot of clarification on the three criterion, and I invite you all to read the panel reports, which are public. There were some questions about the process and the calendars this morning and during lunchtime. I won't go into the detail because of the process, because the focus here is really more about the European dimension and the broader picture. But let me say that there is a pre-selection at national level and a selection at European level. The pre-selection at national level is organized by each country according to the principle of subsidiarity. And some countries organize a call, others have other mechanisms. And then there is a selection at the European level by the panel that I'm presiding. The panel was given the brief to, let's say, to be ambitious and to have a high quality label. Thank you, Commission, for giving us that brief in our very, very first year, because the members of the jury present here will remember that very first meeting where, before we looked at the application, we read again the criteria and the legal basis. And we were thinking, what does this mean and what is the vision? And it's because we developed that vision that we were able to, let's say, to be consistent, but also quite demanding. And on the other hand, we have been trying for all these years to help candidate sites to make the best applications. Now, the full list of the pre-selected sites by the by the countries is public. And there is an important mechanism which has not been used so far, but which is interesting, especially to avoid the abuse of the European Heritage Label for other purposes or too nationalistic purposes, because anyone can write to the Commission looking at the list and saying, we think there's a problem with this site. But again, so far, that mechanism has never ever been used. This brings me, the selection is every 2 years, during the odd years, and there's a monitoring process every 4 years, and an evaluation every 6 years. We had a first monitoring in 2016. We thought it was too early, but we had a wonderful dialogue with the sites. So in the end, it was maybe better to have a monitoring in 2016 already instead of waiting for too long. And the evaluation year is now, as Mr. Magnier mentioned. The selection year, well, next year is again a selection year, 2019, so most of the countries are now pre-selecting their site. I'm coming to the section of what I would call the frequently asked questions. And maybe we should start with the first question. How is the panel designated? Several people asked me. Well, it's very simple. 4 experts are designated by the European Commission, 4 by the Council, 4 by the Parliament, and 1 by the Committee of the Regions. And it's extremely important that the institutions will look at the designation of the panel, ensure that the experts have the necessary reading and communicating skills to read applications in different languages than their native language and can write reports, but also that they have complementary expertise. If we all have conservation architects, we are in trouble. If we only have, or a majority are experts on intangible heritage, we are in trouble. We need people from all boards and from many different nationalities, and that's very important. There is a rotation principle so that there is, let's say, that fresh ideas are coming in the panel, but on the other hand, there is also continuity. So in fact, every year, let's say about 4 experts are renewed. That was a first question. The next question is, who can apply? Can all sites from all countries apply? And which Europe are we talking about? Is it this Europe, the Europe of the Council of Europe? But the reason why I've taken this picture, this map, and not another map, is that it shows the founding members of the Council of Europe, and then the situation today. So even the membership of the Council of Europe is not a static thing. We need to keep that in mind. And for instance, when Jean-Louis Luxen was chairing the Cultural Heritage Committee of the Council of Europe, how many member states were there? 17. In 75, the year of the campaign, A Future for Our Past, there were 18 member states, yes. When I chaired the same committee, we had already enlarged membership towards the east, so it was a totally different setting. So is this the map of Europe for the European Heritage Label? Or are these the chairs? Again, the founding members, and then the Europe in 2010. And I can tell you there are indeed a few empty chairs. So it's not only the chair of the UK that will be empty soon by their choice, but actually countries for the European Heritage Label have to declare that they intend to participate. And this is very frustrating, actually, for sites who want to participate. I can tell you that even last week, I was approached by people from Scotland who wanted to participate quickly in 2019. And there has been a considerable interest from countries that do not yet participate. But I can reassure you that most countries do participate. And I was quite interested to hear the reflection this morning about the East and the West and how they come together. It's something that we need to have in mind. And maybe we should not just stop at the borders of the EU. The panel made a recommendation to open it up because Europe is Europe. Another question that we hear often is this a label for eternity? Once you have been designated, does it stop there? Well, the answer is no, and I can mention immediately there is a monitoring, I mentioned it already, and sites can actually lose the label if they do not have a project anymore or if they do not have the operational capacity anymore. The panel considered that, of course, once a site has a European dimension recognized, you cannot withdraw that European dimension. That's quite obvious. But in terms of projects and operational capacity, things are not written in stone. But then you see also a photograph below of one of the network meetings during the monitoring year, because one of the benefits of the sites is the network of the sites. But I look forward to hearing more from the sites, what they expect from the network. Maybe there is some more potential. About the benefits, you see two more photographs of encounters. No, there is no money attached to the European Heritage Label, and this is very frustrating also for panel members who see all the effort that the sites have. But they have a lot of opportunities. And it's extremely sad to see how much financial support the EU is giving, for instance, to World Heritage sites, and nothing to its own initiative for sites in Europe that are so closely connected also to the local audiences and the national audiences. It brings prestige and visibility according to the sites. There is potential for network and for cooperation amongst the sites, and we have already seen various cooperation between the sites since they have been granted the label. So a strong network of sites was a key recommendation by the panel, and I'm sure that everybody in the room is absolutely delighted by the announcement by Mr. Magnier, and we can only applaud it. We hope that the, let's say, that the connection with the European Heritage Label sites themselves will be one criterion for the selection of this network, because it will be very, very important that the, let's say, that the one who will develop or animate the network has a deep understanding of what it is to be a European Heritage Label site. And then I come to something extremely, extremely let's say, tricky. It's the patchwork. Do we have a credible list of European Heritage Label sites? Professor Kakulewski mentioned it also, and it's indeed a killer question. I attended a meeting in Paris where there was a list, not even a photograph of all the sites, and scholars were criticizing the list because they thought it was not credible. And the very, very funny thing was that those researchers, those who were criticizing the list, were the same researchers who were advocating in favor of a bottom-up approach. Now, the fact that this list is a kind of patchy, let's say, it's a patchwork that illustrates the diversity of the sites, is precisely because it's not a top-down approach. It's something in between. It's not set up by a bunch of scholars in an ivory tower. No, not at all. There's a panel indeed, a European panel, but that panel is dependent on the application it gets. And the panel has been very supportive to candidate sites, and that's precisely the reason why we put so much effort in explaining the criteria. So once again, for the national coordinators, do not hesitate to put a report, or at least a part of a report, on the explanation of the criteria in the hands of your candidate sites. The question was raised this morning also that we were lacking a European narrative. Yes, of course. But that's part of the same story. However, and the panel was very aware of that from the very, very beginning, and it was mentioned even in several speeches. What the panel has always asked the sites to do is to contextualize their own story and their own narrative. So, in fact, if we were to start with an ideal list or a representative list of Europe, it would be the world upside down, because you have to start from the connection with the people. But of course, what you need is expertise, and you need expertise for the contextualization and for the selection at all levels. You need it at the level of the sites, so that they present their story in this global context. You need it at the level of the member states, so that they take into account that the added value is this European perspective, and you need it at the level of the panel. Something about the challenges and the lessons learned. I will only mention a few of them. Of course, the rediscovery of the European dimension and this contextualization is a real challenge. I mentioned that already. What is important for the panel is that we can link the levels of understanding from the local to the regional, to the national, to European level, and at the same time offering emotional and an intellectual heritage experience in Europe. This is, by the way, the fourth Polish site, and I will say something more about it in a few minutes. Diversity. I mentioned already the diversity of the different types of heritage, but there's something else about the diversity. It's the diversity of perspectives that is really important, because how the applications present their European dimension varies upon location, center or periphery, history, for instance, the Baltic state versus the founding member states of the EEC, training, personal stories, what people learn at school. Then we come to something that Jean-Louis Luxen presented in much more detail. But it's true that all the sites that are awarded the European Heritage Label want to tell and share their stories, and they are extremely enthusiastic about it. This is not about making publicity for the EU. This is really about the sites themselves. The aim is not the glorification or the celebration of the past, because you cannot always do that, especially with difficult heritage. You have to be humble in front of history, but you have to face it. History cannot be undone, unless in Harry Potter books. And even so, with, let's say, with a lot of pitfalls. One of the pitfalls for the European Heritage Label is to rewrite history. It's anachronism or presentism, reading today's values in old sites. We have received an application one year that was called The First Europeans. It's also, let's say, negating the mistakes that have been made. So to be very balanced, polyphony, like Professor Kakulewski mentioned, is the key. But on the other hand, you need also to be courage. Another thing is handling motivations. They're driven, the sites are all driven by the enthusiasm to share their stories. But in the World Heritage, in some audiences, I say that the World Heritage Convention has almost become the World Tourism Convention. And that's a real problem. So are sites motivated to introduce an application to attract tourists, to get European money through other programs, because that was an initial idea, but is that really what we want? Is it, what is the real motivation? And then we come with interpretation. The focus of the World Heritage Convention is on conservation, or should be. The focus of the European Heritage Label is on interpretation. But who is doing this interpretation? Is it left to the tourism industry? Is it for nationalism? Are we rewriting history? And for those who do not recognize the photograph, maybe the younger people in the audience do, this photograph is used in the manual of Photoshop on the web. And actually, it's quite funny that they have chosen a one-way direction. It's not exactly what we want. The panel thinks that the European Heritage Label can continue to deepen the knowledge and understanding of their significance. But this is not static, as Jean-Louis Luxen said, but we need to work on that together with the sites. Now, a few concluding remarks. Is the European Heritage Label a cherry on the cake, or just a gadget? No, absolutely not. I think that everybody here in the room can say no, it doesn't. On the contrary, it stands out. It's one of the few cultural programs with a cultural aim. Most remarkably, it's managed directly by the European Commission. And it stands out for several reasons. Because of the holistic view, the criteria, the network, the monitoring, the people-centered approach, because it's linked to audiences starting from local, national to European. And the other thing is that we noticed that there was a lot of research from the very, very beginning. From the first year, at our first meeting of the panel, we were aware that there was already a master thesis. Now, this is a little bit too early. And the European Heritage Label is still in its infant years. But on the other hand, it has already a lot of impact. And why? Because thanks to the European Heritage Label, people have been thinking more than before about what it means to have a European dimension. The panel does not think that the ultimate answer has been given, but at least the question has been raised. And there has been a call for European heritage stories. And even the European Heritage Awards conducted with Europa Nostra have already been influenced. When you look at the narrative, it's clear that the narrative now is different, the presentation is different from what it was before. So there has already a lot of impact, and more actually than we had hoped. However, the question arises whether the question does not arise whether there is a common heritage interest in heritage. The Eurobarometer has shown this, but actually this morning the same question was raised: whether there is an interest in a common heritage, and there's maybe a little bit more work to be done, also at European level. It was mentioned also at the Cultural Heritage Summit in Berlin. There was a strong call for European support for more and micro local projects, for structural support of associations, and for maintenance of cultural heritage, instead of just financial and macro projects. And the interesting idea behind that was that those projects are rooted in communities. They create jobs, and they link Europe again with the citizens, which Europe needs. And just today, this morning, a letter was published by more than 200 academics about the need for Europe to think in terms of post-growth. And here, heritage can play an important role. So what we are advocating for is a little bit more attention from our decision makers, and from the Commission, and from the Parliament, and from people in our own countries. We would like to have Mr. Juncker in Schengen. That it would be nicer for my presentation. But this picture is the last travel of President Obama, who came to ancient Athens, labeled sites, and recalled the fundamentals of democracy. We would also like a little bit of more of communication, and then actually the panel advocated to the sites that they use the European Heritage Days, that they use the social media, that they train their staff about why they received the European Heritage label. But may I very humbly suggest that the European Commission and the European Parliament do the same. I was very, very sorry to see that when the Commission paid tribute to the 3 May Constitution, it did not mention that the Constitution had received the European Heritage label. So maybe in the communication department of the Commission, there's some work to be done. But we know that the European Heritage label is Cinderella, and we know how the story ends. So with the proposals of Mr. Magnier this morning, I look toward the future with a lot of hope. Cultural heritage and history require detective work. It requires curiosity from the expert, from the managers, but also from the people. It requires intelligence. It requires support of academics. It requires new skills. But it requires also more time than this Sherlock is taking. It requires maintaining a culture of debate, critical reflection, and the possibility of voicing different opinions and listening to different stories. We are all convinced that sharing heritage and sharing responsibility for cultural heritage has benefits for the well-being of peoples and for the cultural heritage itself. After all, the purpose is to access and enjoy the cultural heritage and to transmit it to future generations. The creation of a European space of education, which was announced following the Göteborg summit, has to be applauded. But may we say that the European space of cultural heritage already exists? We are surrounded by us. When we arrived here this morning, we crossed it. The only thing that needs to be done is to provide support for linking the local, regional, and national dimension and support of support for cultural heritage. And the European Heritage Label is a perfect laboratory to get this launched. Thank you for your attention.